How well do films capture reality? How well should they capture reality? Naturalism is an approach to film that tries to capture things as they actually are. Naturalistic colour grading at the extreme end will attempt to recreate the colours as you see them with your eyes in the real world. Naturalistic dialogue at the extreme end will be indistinguishable from real speech, with all the pausing and self-correcting and meandering that happens when people don't think they're being filmed. A naturalistic plot will show things playing out very realistically, with the characters motivated by what those characters would actually be motivated by, rather than by what makes things most dramatic on screen. These things have informed a lot of upcoming film projects I've been working on with my friends, so I thought I'd delve into some of them in a video. Let's start with colour grading. If you were colour grading a film and you wanted to make a colour grade that was very naturalistic, very close to what the eye sees, what would that actually look like? I took several shots of the garden here with a DaVinci Blackmagic 4K and concurrently took a photo on my phone. At the same time, before the sunlight changed, I shaded the screen of my phone and compared the colours on my phone to the colours I could see with my eye, and made notes about the subtle ways in which the phone picture was different to reality. I then used these notes and the phone photo to inform a colour grade of the Blackmagic footage. This is what I came out with. This wasn't just a filter I applied over the whole thing. I used DaVinci's tools to modify the hue and saturation of individual colours, and this was the outcome. Before I go into detail, I'll explain the reason that I did this. Some close friends and I have been making films for many years now, of increasingly high production value. And we all have different creative interests that I think harmonise together quite well. But one of my own creative interests is naturalism, very naturalistic dialogue, very naturalistic situations, even at the expense of things like pacing and script writing convention, because I personally think that can help an audience to sympathise with the characters more and really feel as though they're real people. I also like the idea of portraying different kinds of human experience on screen, different ways of experiencing being a human, and I think that that's best done by putting you in that person's normality, showing you what is the norm for that person. And this focus on naturalism has kind of come to the fore recently in discussions around the colour grading and lighting of the film adaptation of Wicked. Several YouTubers have made videos about how it looks washed out and desaturated and low contrast, and often the implication is that that's a bad thing. When I was younger, when I was maybe a child or a teenager, I had a difficult relationship with these kinds of high contrast, high saturation colour grades that you see in 70s and 80s films. And I think that's kind of the same difficult relationship that an 18-year-old might have with whiskey. I liked the aesthetic of being the kind of person who drank whiskey, but I found whiskey horrible, you know. In the same way, I liked the idea of being the kind of person who liked these classic films and really enjoyed the way they were shot, the artistry of it, but I just found them unpleasant to look at. This isn't something I find quite so much anymore. I feel like I can appreciate them a bit more now, but they're certainly not my go-to when I want to watch a film. I still find the look kind of jarring. This isn't an objective, you know, this is not some objective statement about this way of grading and lighting, of course, it's just my opinion. But when I watched these videos, especially a particular video by this creator, I found myself feeling a twinge of irritation that somebody was suggesting that flatter, less saturated colour grades are bad and need to be put in the dustbin, while this older style of colour grading, which I still don't really like that much most of the time, is the way that everybody should be grading their films. I don't think that this YouTuber is necessarily advocating for or against films being naturalistic, although he does make one point that colour in real life is very saturated and contrasty, which I don't think is true in the way that he thinks it is, hence my little exercise towards the start of this video. I think his broader point is that films should be heightened. You go because you want to see a piece of art, not because you want to see reality. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing his opinion there, but you don't want to see all the detail in the shadows. You want them to be inky black. You want there to be a lot of contrast, because contrast is what makes films exciting. And he puts this down to a lack of intentionality. In other words, the crew, the director, the cinematographer, while they were on set, didn't want to commit to too extreme a look, because they weren't yet sure how the film was going to look after it had been colour graded. Maybe they intended to put a load of computer generated imagery in, which would be harder if they'd decided on a very extreme lighting setup, and so they just go for a very flat colour profile to be safe. And I think this almost certainly is true in some cases. Maybe directors do look back at their films and wish that they'd made bolder choices, but I certainly don't think it's true in all cases. And I don't know, I feel like it's part of something of a kind of an anti-naturalism movement, not like an organised movement, but a general school of thought that naturalism should be used extremely sparingly in films, that you can use a bit of naturalistic dialogue to convey character or to get the audience involved, but that you should use it very intentionally and very sparingly, because too much naturalism is boring and it makes the pacing bad and it makes things look bad. And this is something that I just very strongly disagree with, so I wanted to put an alternative opinion out there. Anyway, the shots I graded, in general, don't surprise me very much. I find the best way to look at them is to close one eye, encapsulate the other with your hands so that you have only a small field of view, and to me, as someone who pays attention to colour a lot, this looks like how I remember the scene actually looking. To me, this makes these shots all the nicer. It flips some little switch in my brain that makes me remember what it was like to be there. I wonder if the man whose video I watched would suggest that this looked washed out and too much like the log image that the camera spits out before you grade it, which is what he said about this still from Deadpool and Wolverine, although he might have used the wrong still by mistake, because this is what log images actually look like. That was a little bit catty, I apologise for that one. But I think the best counterpoint to what I'm saying is that films don't have to be colour graded to look exactly colour accurate, far from it. In the same way that you don't have to make films about mundane or realistic subjects, you also don't have to give them mundane or realistic colour grades. You can develop a whole system of conventions around what types of colour grade and lighting signal what things to the viewer. Dark, high contrast grades indicate one thing, slightly green tinted shots might indicate another, and so on. This can be good as a kind of shorthand. Rather than showing 10 minutes of a character being increasingly nervous about a meeting with a drug baron, you can just signal the scariness and tension of the meeting visually. It's a way of maximising what you can do with only two experiential channels, video and audio, rather than the dozens of channels of experience an actual human is having all the time. But by using video and audio in this way, you effectively siphon off their ability to straightforwardly communicate actual visual scenes and actual sound. A while ago I watched the Black Mirror film Bandersnatch, which I think has a really nice looking colour grade. There's a scene where the characters are on LSD, a drug which can famously increase the saturation and contrast of your vision for a few hours and tint the colours in strange ways. But of course you can't do that if the entire film has been graded to the extremes of saturation and contrast that an audience will accept. You have to either grade the LSD scenes the same way as everything else, or push it into a territory that just mischaracterises the experience of being on LSD. LSD can produce relatively small changes in the colours you see, which nonetheless feel very significant, partly because the LSD messes with your attention system and makes things seem more important than they are, and partly because your vision has such a consistently high dynamic range and consistent colour representation that it's really weird when it changes at all, especially if you're in a place that you're familiar with. This isn't a dig at Bandersnatch necessarily. Some LSD users report basically no visual effects and others report very extreme colour disturbances. But it's an example of where the embeddedness of film convention might make it harder for certain scenes to get their point across. I had this specific problem when deciding how to grade my upcoming film The Mystery of the Romans, which attempts to show some of the experiences that LSD causes. To get across the actual change from normal experience to LSD experience, I needed to spend quite a lot of time establishing what normal was within this film. I felt the need to prime the audience to accept a certain colour grade as the norm. But what do you go for? Do you go as natural as possible until the acid comes in? I'd already decided to light the film mostly naturally, only using supplementary lights for scenes that weren't set in reality, and this, combined with a totally realistic colour grade, has the unfortunate effect of making it look, for want of a better term, student filmy. To explain what I mean, I'll show you this shot from our upcoming historical web series, Living Memory. We did several takes of this scene across about 5 hours, using only sunlight and the room light. While the sunlight takes maybe look a bit more conventionally cinematic, the room light takes have the best performance. Here's one of them graded approximately colour accurately. Now, I actually quite like this. I think the shallow depth of field, the fact that it blurs into the background, helps quite a lot. But it only has those things because of the quite expensive lens and camera we used. If it had been shot on a phone camera or something, you could certainly accuse it of looking sort of unprofessional. But I'm sure plenty of working class people in the late 40s did just make do with one room light. I do that in my own office because I can't be bothered to bring a lamp in here. Now, of course, putting a couple of lamps around the room wouldn't make it historically inaccurate, but other things like seating characters in the middle of the room so there's a lot of nice depth in the background, or positioning them in a certain way so their conversation looks good on camera, would certainly start to detract from the reality of what these people would actually do in this room if they didn't think they were being filmed. The best light for reading a book might not be the most cinematic on the person's face. We aren't lit beautifully all the time. We don't position ourselves photogenically when we're chatting to each other. As I say, this probably doesn't matter for the vast majority of films, but if you want to convey a specific experience that has a visual element to it, a cinematic convention can definitely stand in the way. Now, obviously, I'm by no means the first person to have thought of these things. I know of, a dozen filmmakers, and there are probably hundreds more that have thought of the exact same things, and emphasised different aspects of naturalism. I think there was a movement in the 90s called Dogma 95 or Dalma 95, if you'll excuse my Danish pronunciation, and this proposed a set of rules to get cinema back to something grounded and remove it from the kind of aesthetically driven thing that it had become. So these rules were things like you have to shoot on a location and it has to be a real location, that you can't bring props to the location, you just have to use what's there, you can't record additional sound after the initial recording, it has to all be real sound that was in the room. That includes music, you can't put a score over the top, you just have to use, if there is music, it has to be music that was actually playing, that the characters could hear. And this is maybe kind of the extremist form of naturalism that you can get, in the sense that nothing is created for the camera. And that's not necessarily what I try to do, what we try to do in our films. I like covering historical settings and using naturalism as a way into those settings to sort of make the viewer think, wow, this is as close as I'll get to what it was actually like in the 40s or the 80s, assuming you weren't alive in the 40s or the 80s. And Dalma 95 wouldn't allow that. It prohibits historical settings because, of course, you can't really take a cinema camera back to 1945. That's impossible. Anything you do is going to be at least a little bit historically inaccurate, no matter how much you try to make it perfect. At the end of the day, these people, the actors that you're using, didn't exist back then, or at the very least they weren't this age that they currently are back then, and so there's always a layer of unnaturalness. If you're trying to incorporate real historical language, real historical mannerisms, there may be nobody left alive that speaks like that, and so you're going to have to do various kinds of work with your actors to teach them to naturalistically produce that language and those mannerisms. A recent film that I think did this kind of thing fantastically was The Zone of Interest. and I don't think this counts as a spoiler because it's kind of obvious from the outset, but it's set around the commandant of Auschwitz in the 1940s. He lives over the wall from the concentration camp. None of the atrocities of the concentration camp are actually shown explicitly, but it's literally just totally naturalistic portrayals of his family life, him walking around the house, doing things, turning the lights off, talking to his family. And a lot of things are shown at length in a way that they never normally would be in a feature film. And I think the point of this very intensive naturalism was to get across that this person was a human, and it's not monsters that do these things, it's people, you know. I suppose you could read it a number of ways, but I read it as people are the dangerous ones. It's people that carry out these atrocities, and we shouldn't imagine that it's some ethereal monster or some demon that enacts these horrible things, because at the end of the day it's just people in a certain situation with a certain amount of power that do these things. And I thought the point came across very well because this naturalism was utilised, this completely mundane portrayal of this guy who is compartmentalising the horrible things he's doing and his family life. I would absolutely recommend giving that a watch. The colour grade, as far as I can work out, is extremely naturalistic. I wonder if it's maybe a tiny bit like blue tinted or something, but I can't even tell. It's so close to natural that I'm not sure what they've done to it. To me it seems totally naturalistic, and very particularly it doesn't seem like they've positioned the lights in the house to look nice. It doesn't seem like they've positioned the windows or the cameras to look nice. It's supposed to look totally normal, and it does. In the late 90s, Gary Oldman, who's best known as a very good character actor, directed a film called Nil by Mouth, and I think it's the only film he's ever directed. And an interview with Oldman about the direction of this film resonated with me a lot. He said, I think, that you would think that cinema had started with Reservoir Dogs, and ever since then people have just been imitating each other's films, imitating each other's dialogue, rather than drawing from real life. Nil by Mouth focused on a working class family in London with a lot of alcoholism, a lot of abuse. The dialogue was extremely naturalistic, even though it was scripted. Sometimes scripting things takes away from the naturalism of the dialogue, but in this case I think it works really well. And to me it feels all the more powerful, all the more hard-hitting. If he'd just copied existing cinema convention and existing screenwriting convention, I don't think it would have been anywhere near as convincing, because it would have just felt like a sequence of things happening rather than a sequence of things happening to real people. I think another thing that can get in the way of this kind of naturalism is a desire to say something with the film, a desire to get some kind of point across. And again, I don't think this is a bad thing at all. I think it's something that many films achieve very well, and they're good films. But it doesn't always have to say something. That doesn't always have to be the main point. In the mid-1980s, I think, the famous British director Mike Leigh released his film Meantime, which was about a working class young adult man who is struggling to find a job, struggling with various things, clearly kind of neurodivergent and, struggling to be accepted from that angle. And when he released the film, he got feedback from left-wing groups who said that he, the director, Mike Leigh, had failed to make a kind of left-wing point, had an opportunity to make some real point about the class system and just had squandered that opportunity. And of course, that wasn't the point of the film. That wasn't what he was trying to do. He wasn't trying to demonstrate some manifesto. He just got a load of actors, worked with them for weeks or months to develop these realistic characters, and then let the characters do whatever they would do. If you film a real-life set of people and then make a film out of it, it's not going to necessarily demonstrate any kind of political point. It's not necessarily going to have a takeaway message. And because Mike Leigh is going for realistic characters in realistic situations, without engineering the dialogue, without engineering the scenes and the situations, a message is not necessarily going to emerge from that. In 2 weeks, we'll be releasing The Mystery of the Romans, and in a few months, probably mid-year, we'll be releasing the first 4 episodes of our historical naturalistic series, Living Memory. They should be on this channel. There'll be various bits of supplementary material, and you can also sign up to our email mailing list for an update when it comes out if you'd like to. In the meantime, I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on naturalism in film in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.